Well, hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. We have three topics tonight. One is exodus from Zionism. The second is Ukrainian war funding. And the third is Jamie Galbraith on industrial policy. Very interesting things to talk about. And okay, I hope you'll enjoy the show. I'll start off with exodus, from Zionism, which is the title of a speech that was given by Naomi Klein at the emergency Seder held on the New York City streets very recently. We'll be going over a transcript of a speech delivered at the emergency Seder in the streets of New York. And but Klein, of course, Naomi Klein is a Guardian U.S. columnist and contributing writer. She's the professor of climate justice and co-director of the Center for Climate Justice at the University of British Columbia. Her latest book, Doppelganger, A Trip into the Mirror World, was published in September. I haven't read that book. The title sounds very interesting. I'll have to pursue that after the show. But our title comes from her title, which is We Need an Exodus from Zionism. This Passover, we don't need or want the false idol of Zionism. We want freedom from the project that commits genocide in our name. This is dated April 28, 2024. Naomi Klein. It was originally published in The Guardian, and I picked it up at portside.com. And there's a graphic. There are people holding kites or signs, but the quote is, "Too many of our people are worshiping a false idol once again," unquote. This is by Thalia Juarez of The Guardian. And Klein says, I've been thinking about Moses and his rage when he came down from the mount to find the Israelites worshiping a golden calf. The ecofeminist in me was always uneasy about this story. What kind of God is jealous of animals? What kind of God wants to hoard all the sacredness of the earth for himself? But there is a less literal way of understanding the story. It is about false idols, about the human tendency to worship the profane and shiny, to look to the small and material rather than the large and transcendent. And I must confess, now I'm commenting on this, I must confess that that was always the way I interpreted the story of the golden calf, that it was about the worship of false idols. What I want to say to you tonight at this revolutionary and historic Seder in the streets is that too many of our people are worshiping a false idol once again. They are enraptured by it, drunk on it, profaned by it. That false idol is called Zionism. Zionism is a false idol. It has taken the idea of the promised land and turned it into a deed of sale for a militaristic ethno-state. She couldn't have described Israel more truthfully than that. That's my comment. It is a false idol that takes on us profound biblical stories of justice and emancipation from slavery. The story of Passover itself turns them into brutalist weapons of colonial land theft, roadmaps for ethnic cleansing, and genocide. It is a false idol that has taken the transcendent idea of the promised land, a metaphor for human liberation, that has traveled across multiple faiths to every corner of this globe, and dared to turn it into a deed of sale for a militaristic ethno-state. Political Zionism's the version of liberalism, is itself profane. From the start, it required the mass expulsion of Palestinians from their homes and ancestral lands in the Nakba. 750,000 of the Palestinians to comment on that sentence. From the start, it has been at war with dreams, of liberation. At a Seder, it is worth remembering that this includes the dreams of liberation and self-determination of the Egyptian people. The false idol of Zionism equates Israeli safety with Egyptian dictatorship and client states. From the start, it has produced an ugly kind of freedom that saw Palestinian children not as human beings, but as demographic threats. Much as the Pharaoh in the book of Exodus feared the growing population of Israelites and thus ordered the death of their sons. Of course, the firstborn, in the Bible. Zionism has brought us to a present moment of cataclysm, and it is time that we said clearly, it has always been leading us here. It is a false idol that has led far too many of our own people down a deeply immoral path that now has them justifying the shredding of core commandments. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet. We in these streets for months and months are the exodus from Zionism. It is a false ideal that equates Jewish children with cluster bombs that kill and maim Palestinian children. Zionism is a false ideal that has betrayed every Jewish value, including the value we place on questioning, a practice embedded in the Seder with its 4 questions asked by the youngest child, including the love we have as a people for text and for education. Today, this false ideal justifies the bombing of every university in Gaza, the destruction of countless schools, of archives, of printing presses, the killing of hundreds of academics, of journalists, of poets. This is what Palestinians call scholasticide, the killing of the means of education. Meanwhile, in this city, the universities call in the NYPD and barricade themselves against the grave threat posed by their own students, daring to ask them basic questions such as, how can you claim to believe in anything at all, least of all us, while you enable, invest in, and collaborate with this genocide? The false ideal of Zionism has been allowed to grow unchecked for far too long. So tonight we say it ends here. Our Judaism cannot be contained by an ethno-state, for our Judaism is internationalist by nature. Our Judaism cannot be protected by the rampaging military of that state. For all that military does is sow sorrow and reap hatred, including against us as Jews. Our Judaism is not threatened by people raising their voices in solidarity with Palestine across lines of race, ethnicity, physical ability, gender identity, and generations. Our Judaism is one of those voices and knows that in that chorus lies both our safety and our collective liberation. Our Judaism is the Judaism of the Passover Seder, the gathering in ceremony to share food and wine with loved ones and neighbors alike. The ritual that is inherently portable, light enough to carry on our backs, in need of nothing but each other, no walls, no temple, no rabbi, a role for everyone, even especially the smallest child. The Seder is a diaspora technology, if there ever was one, made for collective grieving, contemplation, questioning, remembering, and reviving the revolutionary spirit. So look around. This here is our Judaism. As waters rise and forests burn, and nothing is certain, we pray at the altar of solidarity and mutual aid, no matter the cost. We don't need or want the false idol of Zionism. We want freedom from the project that commits genocide in our name. Freedom from an ideology that has no plan for peace other than deals with murderous, theocratic petrostates next door, while selling the technologies of robo-assassinations to the world. We seek to liberate Judaism from an ethno-state that wants Jews to be perennially afraid. It wants our children to be afraid. It wants us to believe the world is against us so that we go running to its fortress and beneath its iron dome, or at least keep the weapons and donations flowing. That is the false idol. And it's not just Netanyahu. It's the world he made and that made him. It's Zionism. What are we? We in these streets for months and months are the exodus from Zionism. And to the Chuck Schumers of this world, we do not say, quote, let our people go. We say, quote, we have already gone. And your kids, they're with us now, unquote. So that's the transcript. That's the speech. It was a magnificent speech that was given at the emergency Seder in the streets, in New York City. If you haven't seen it, I recommend that you see it and you see her give it. It is absolutely magnificent in expressing the feelings of those Jews who have abandoned the the idol, of Zionism, and who have turned to the humanistic view of what ought to be done in Palestine. So, I will check for your comments now to see if there are any. And there is K. Ryan, Andy Candy. Hiya, Joepedia. Just came over from Richard. He's still going strong. Shared this. I'm flattered that you're here, Andy, because Richard can be quite compelling. Kay says, hi, Andy. Andy says, hi, Kay. Steve Wolfbrand says, hello, everybody. Hello, Steve. How are you? Great to see you here. And Steve says, hi, Andy. Saw you on Richard's stream. I guess Richard was on just before. Kay says, Columbia U is coming apart. NYPD going in soon. That's such a terrible, terrible shame. Judging from what happened in 1968, Columbia University will not get over this for years and years. The president of the university, by calling in the NYPD, has betrayed her trust, betrayed Columbia University, itself. It won't be a great university again for some time, if ever. Our next topic for tonight is Ukraine war funding. It was a great piece written by Jack Rasmus, who's a fine economist, though not an MMTer. And he wrote a really good piece on Ukraine war funding and failed Russian sanctions. The tagline for the post is, Russia is extremely unlikely to fall a third time for a Biden NATO request to freeze military operations and to negotiate again. And this was written on April 24th, 2024. And it was original to LA Progressive, I guess. Oh, no, it was updated April 24th, 2024. This is the updated version. And there is a graphic of the cartoonish Uncle Sam reaching for Ukraine in the manner in which that great painting by Michelangelo, in which God is reaching for humankind. The United States is reaching for Ukraine in some way. The United States playing God. This past weekend, April 20th, 2024, the U.S. House of Representatives passed a bill to provide Ukraine with another $61 billion in aid. The measure quickly passed the Senate and almost immediately signed into law by President Biden. The funds, however, will make little difference to the outcome of the war on the ground, as it appears most of the military hardware funded by the $61 billion has already been produced and much of it already shipped. Perhaps no more than $10 billion in additional new weapons and equipment will result from the latest $61 billion passed by Congress, subject to revision. Initial reports of the composition of the $61 billion indicate $23.2 billion of it will go to pay U.S. arms producers for weapons that have already been produced and delivered to Ukraine. Another $13.8 billion, is earmarked to replace weapons from U.S. military stocks that have been produced and are in the process of being shipped, but haven't as yet, or are additional weapons still to be produced. The breakdown of this latter $13.8 billion is not clear in the initial reports. One might generously guess that perhaps $10 billion at most represents weapons not yet produced, while $25 to $30 billion represents weapons already shipped to Ukraine or in the current shipment pipeline. In total, therefore, weapons already delivered to Ukraine, awaiting shipment or yet to be produced, amount to approximately $37 billion. The remainder of the $61 billion includes $7.8 billion for financial assistance to pay for salaries of government employees through 2024. If I can comment on that, that's probably going to find its way into the pockets of those who control the money in one of the most corrupt governmental systems, in the world. An additional $11.3 billion to finance current Pentagon operations in Ukraine, which sounds suspiciously like pay for U.S. advisors, of mercenaries, special ops, and U.S. forces operating equipment such as radars, advanced Patriot missile systems, etc., on the ground. Another $4.7 billion is for miscellaneous expenses, whatever that is. Yes, whatever that is, one wonders. In other words, only $13.8 billion of the $61 billion is for weapons Ukraine doesn't already have. That $13.8 billion is all Ukraine will likely get in new weapons funding for the rest of 2024. Like the $23 billion already in theater, that will likely be burned up in a couple of weeks this summer once Russia's major offensive, its largest of the war, is launched in late May or early June. So what does the U.S. do in order to continue to fund Ukraine's economy, government, and military efforts this fall and thereafter? In other words, what's the Biden strategy for aiding Ukraine economically and militarily after the $37 billion is expended by late this summer? Where's the money to come from? To understand how the U.S. NATO plan to fund subsequent weapons production for Ukraine in late 2024 and early 2025, one must consider not only the $61 billion bill, but a second bill also passed by Congress this past weekend that hasn't been given much attention in the mainstream media. That second bill may potentially provide up to $300 billion for Ukraine from U.S. and its G7 allies, especially NATO allies in Europe, where reportedly 260 of the $300 billion resides in Eurozone banks. Biden U.S. short-term strategy in 2024, the $61 billion is clearly only a stopgap measure to try to get the Ukraine army and government funded through the summer. Beyond that, The Biden strategy is to keep Ukraine afloat until after the U.S. November elections. In addition to the $61 billion, which the U.S. hopes will get by Ukraine through the U.S. November election, but likely won't, says Jack Rasmus. U.S. strategy includes getting the Russians to agree to begin some kind of negotiations. The U.S. will then use the discussions to raise a demand to freeze military operations on both sides while negotiations are underway. But Biden's, quote, freeze and negotiate, unquote, strategy is dead on arrival, since it is abundantly clear to the Russians it is basically about U.S. and NATO buying time, quote unquote, and Russia has already been played by that one. As the popular U.S. saying goes, quotes, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me, unquote. Isn't there something in there about you can't get fooled again? The Russians already fell for that, quote, let's suspend fighting, and uh, but the fight and bargain ploy, unquote. With the Minsk II treaty back in 2015, 2016, it agreed to halt the military operations in the Donbass back then, but NATO and the Ukraine government used the Minsk agreement as cover to rebuild Ukraine's military force, which it thereafter used to attack the Donbass provinces by European leaders, Angela Merkel of Germany and Francois Hollande of France, thereafter publicly admitted in 2022 that Minsk II was just a, quote, buy time, unquote. The Russians were again similarly snookered at the Istanbul peace discussions held in April 2022. They were asked by NATO to show good faith by withdrawing their forces from around Kyiv, which they did. However, negotiations were then broken off by Zelensky on NATO's strong recommendation, yes, from Boris Johnson, carrying a message from the United States, and Ukraine launched an offensive chasing the withdrawing Russians all the way back to the Donbass borders. Russia is therefore extremely unlikely to fall a third time for a Biden NATO request to, quote, freeze military operations and negotiate again. Biden may want to buy time once more, but that hand's been played twice already, and the West will be, as being told by Russia. They aren't interested in buying anything from the West, and its money, quote unquote, no longer has any value. Speaker Johnson's volte-face, the passage of the stopgap $61 billion for Ukraine by the U.S. House of Representatives was the result of House Speaker Johnson doing an about-face and allowing the vote on the House floor after saying he won for weeks. There's been much speculation in the U.S. mainstream media as to why Johnson reversed his position and allowed the Ukraine aid bill to the House floor for a vote. However, it's not difficult to understand why he did reverse his view. In recent weeks, there was intense lobbying behind the scenes by U.S. weapons companies with key Republican committee chairmen in the House. After all, at least $37 billion in payments for weapons, both already delivered and to be delivered, was involved. Not a minor sum, even for super profitable companies such as Lockheed, Raytheon, and the like. Rumors are that corporate lobbying had its desired effect on Republican committee chairs in the House, who then in turn pressured Johnson to allow the vote on the floor. The final vote in the House was 310 to 111, with 210 Democrats joining 100 Republicans to pass the measure, revealing that the core support for the U.S. military-industrial complex in the House of Representatives is at least three-fourths the U.S. Senate, likely even higher. So the vote was the result of a, quote, parliamentary maneuver, unquote, in which all the Democrats crossed over to support the Republican Speaker of the House, who de facto switched parties for the moment. Also, a minority of Republicans joined him. A majority, but a slim majority of Republicans opposed the measure. Their opposition remains. Thus, it is highly unlikely Congress will appropriate more funding for Ukraine for the rest of this year, even when the $61 billion for weapons in Ukraine's government run out by this late summer. So what happens if and when the $61 billion is exhausted well before the November elections? Possible answer to the question lies in the passage of a second Ukraine funding measure this past weekend. $61 billion was not the most important of the legislative actions in the U.S. House, while most of the media commentary has been on that Ukraine aid bill. Hardly anything has been said in the mainstream media about another bill that the U.S. House also passed over the weekend. This second measure has greater strategic implications for the U.S. global interest than the $37 billion in actual weapon shipments for Ukraine. This second measure is H.R. 8038, a 184-page bill misnamed, quote, the, quote, 21st Century Peace Through Strength Act, which amounted to yet another package, the 16th of U.S. sanctions, transferring Russia's $300 billion assets to Ukraine. The first section of the bill arranges a procedure for the U.S. to force the sale of the China company TikTok to a consortium of U.S. financial investors, reportedly led by former U.S. Treasury Secretary under Trump, Steve Mnuchin. Incredible. I'm sure all the young people who love TikTok are going to continue to love it when TikTok has been bought by Steven Mnuchin. This is part of the expanding list of sanctions on China. Also sanctions are China purchases of Iranian oil, as well as a host of additional sanctions on Iran itself. However, the most significant measure related to sanctions on Russia. The 21st Century Peace Through Strength Act calls for the U.S. to transfer its $5 billion share of Russia's $300 billion of seized assets in Western banks that were frozen in 2022 at the outset of the Ukraine war. It provides a procedure to hand over the $5 billion to Ukraine to further finance its war efforts. This move has been rumored and debated in the USA and Europe since the assets were seized 2 years ago. But now the process of actually transferring the seized funds to Ukraine has begun with the passage of this second bill by the U.S. House. The USA's $5 billion share in U.S. banks is just a drop in the bucket of the $300 billion. Russia could probably care less about it, i.e. a mere rounding error in its total revenue from sale of oil, gas, and other commodities. But Europe holds 260 of the $300 billion, according to European Central Bank Chair Christine Lagarde. A tiny sum, which Russia has threatened, a tidy sum, I should say, not a tiny sum, a tidy sum, which Russia has threatened to retaliate against Europe should the EU follow the U.S. Biden lead and also begin to transfer its $260 billion to Ukraine. The U.S. bill is very clear the transfer of the U.S. $5 billion is imminent. The bill requires the Biden administration to establish a Ukraine defense fund, quote unquote, into which the U.S. $5 billion will be deposited. If parts of the $5 billion are not in liquid asset form, the U.S. president is further authorized by the bill to liquidate those assets and deposit the proceeds in the fund as well. So the seizure and transfer of the $5 billion to Ukraine is a done deal. When it happens, a legal precedent will be made that Europe may use to follow and transfer its $260 billion. One can expect the U.S. to pressure Europe strongly to do so. Biden is further authorized by the bill to, quote, negotiate, unquote, with Europe and other G7 partners to convince them to do the same, i.e., seize their share of the $300 billion, but liquidate and transfer the cash assets into the U.S., quote, Ukraine Defense Fund, unquote. What a joke. And to date, the U.S. has been able to, quote, convince, unquote, Europe via its control of NATO and influence over Europe's economy and its umbrella elites in the European Commission and European Parliament to follow U.S. policy without too much resistance. Europe is fast becoming an economic satrapy and political dependency of the USA in recent decades, more than willing to bend in whatever policy direction the USA wants. It is clear the seizure and distribution to Ukraine of the $300 billion via the Ukraine Defense Fund is the means by which the US-NATO plan, longer term, to continue to finance the Ukraine war after the $60 billion runs out sometime in 2024. And certainly in 2025 and beyond, for the U.S. has no intention of ending its NATO-led proxy war in Ukraine anytime soon. It is just seeking to, quote, buy time, unquote, in the interim before its November elections. For a majority of both parties in the U.S., Democrat and Republican, are united on continuing the war. It will matter little who wins the presidency or which party has majorities in Congress after November. Political elites on both sides of the aisle in Congress are united in pursuing the war in Ukraine, just as they are united in continuing to fund Israel, as well as to continue the U.S.'s steadily expanding economic war with China. In just the past week, it is obvious more U.S. sanctions on China are also coming soon, including possibly announcements of financial sanctions on China for the first time after U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's most recent visit, to use a nickname of Pepe Escobar's, Little Blinky. Failed Russian sanctions, past and future. The geopolitical objectives of the U.S. and its commitment to continuing its three wars are resulting in unintended negative effects on the economies of the U.S. and its G7 allies, especially Germany. But those same sanctions have had little to no negative impact on Russia's economy. The recently passed U.S. transfer of its $5 billion share of Russia's $300 billion will accelerate the negative consequences, especially for Europe, should the latter follow the U.S. lead and distribute its $260 billion share to Ukraine, which it eventually will. As EBC chairperson Lagarde put it recently, she was also formerly the head of the IMF, put it, referring to the U.S. plan and legislation, quote, it needs to be carefully considered, unquote. UK political leaders are already on record advocating the confiscation and transferring of Europe's $260 billion holdings of Russian assets to Ukraine. But if I miss my guess, that's $260 billion that's in the Eurozone banks, not in UK banks. So if UK political leaders are on record advocating the confiscation and transfer, why should the Eurozone people actually listen? I just asked the question. Europe in recent years has a strong history of capitulating to U.S. economic policies and demands. It will be no different this time. Should Europe join the USA in transferring its $260 billion share of Russian assets in European banks, most of which is in Belgium, it's almost certain that Russia will reply similarly and seize at least an equal amount of European assets still in Russia. The Russian parliament has officially recently said as much. Part of the G7 NATO sanctions to date include forcing Western businesses in Russia to liquidate and leave Russia. Some have done so, but many have not. Russia's response has been to arrange the transfer of these EU companies' assets that have left to Russian companies. This has actually stimulated the Russian economy. It resulted in Russian government subsidies and thus government spending to Russian companies assuming the assets, as well as additional investment by those companies after their acquisition of the departed EU companies' assets. In short, Western sanctions, a Western sanctions measure pressuring Western companies to leave Russia has backfired in its predicted result of reducing Russian government spending and business investment. In contrast, the U.S., NATO's 15 or so sanctions packages to date have had little, if any, impact on Russia's economy since the commencing of the war in February 2022. To cite just a few of the performance of Russia's key economic indicators under the sanctions regime, note all following data is from the U.S. Global Research Source. Russia's GDP in the latest 6 months has risen from 4.9% to 5.5% in the third quarter of 2023 to 5.5% in the fourth quarter. Russia's PMI statistics show robust expansion for manufacturing and services during the same period, while in most of the major European economies, both PMI indicators have been contracting. Wage growth in Russia over the 6 months has averaged 8.5% for both quarters, where in the US it is less than half that, and in Germany less than 1%. Russian government revenues rose from roughly 5 trillion rubles in the third quarter to 8.7 trillion in the fourth. Also, military expenditures are up from $69.5 billion to $86.3 billion. Consumer spending is at record levels in the latest quarter. Russian household debt as a percent of GDP remains steady at around 22%, whereas in the USA it is 62.5%. Now that's a significant indicator. Because that's not the government debt, that's the household debt. The government debt literally doesn't mean anything for fiscal sustainability. But that household debt as a percent of GDP, the Russians are doing a lot better than we are. Crude oil production and general exports continue to steadily rise. Gasoline remains at 60 cents a liter, whereas in the US it's 5 to 6 times that, and in Europe more than 10 times that. And the unemployment rate in Russia remains steady at 2.9%, where in the US and Europe it's a quarter to a half higher. Interest rates and inflation are higher in Russia, but that represents an economy firing on all economic cylinders and is not necessarily a negative. In short, it's hard to find a single statistic that shows the Russian economy has been negatively impacted by the US NATO sanctions regime over the past 2 years. Indeed, an argument can even be made that sanctions have stimulated the Russian economy, not undermined it. The latest sanction in the form of the U.S. and G7 transfer to $300 billion in seized Russian assets in Western banks will almost for certain have a similar effect on Russia's economy. Namely, distributing the $300 billion will result in Russian government seizure of at least an equivalent amount of European companies' assets still in Russia. And that will provide funding for still further government subsidy spending benefiting Russian companies, followed by more private investment. Is the U.S. empire shooting itself in the foot? Well, guess what the answer to that question is. But there is an even greater consequence to follow the U.S. and Europe's desperate act of transferring Russia's $300 billion in assets in Western banks to Ukraine. Okay, and we have to get this straight. Okay, it's $300 billion in European assets, which are going to be confiscated by the Russians. in compensation for this seizure of 300 billion in Russian assets. But that most of the 300 billion in Russian assets won't be going to Eurozone countries. They'll be going to Ukraine. If he's still there, some major portion of it will be going to Zelensky and his cronies and the most corrupt government in the world. Going on with the article. Western bankers, economic policymakers, and many economists alike have warned against the seizure and transfer of the $300 billion. Heads of U.S. and other central banks, CEOs of large commercial banks, and even mainstream economists such as Schiller at Yale, but Jack Rasmus is not a mainstream economist, he's a post-Keynesian economist, have continually warned publicly that transferring the assets will seriously undermine faith in the U.S. dollar system, which is the linchpin of the U.S. global economic empire. What countries in the global south will now want to put or leave their assets in Western banks? Well, Argentina, they're run by a crazy man, especially in Europe, if they think the assets could be seized should they disagree on policies promoted by the empire. It's clear the U.S., the hegemon, has now begun to impose, quote, secondary, unquote, sanctions on countries that don't abide by its primary sanctions on Russia. Will the U.S. also seize the assets of these, quote, secondary, unquote, countries now in Western banks if they don't go along with refusing to trade with Russia? And what about China, as the U.S. has now begun to expand its sanctions, primary and secondary, on that country as well? Watch for unprecedented financial sanctions on China that might be forthcoming following Blinken's visit to China this week. And then watch for unprecedented financial counter-sanctions by the Chinese on all those U.S. companies that are operating in China. The U.S. does not realize this is not the 1980s. The global South has developed massively in recent decades. They are insisting on more independence and more say in the rules of the empire, without which they will simply leave now that an alternative is beginning to appear in the expansion of the BRICS countries. Recently expanded to 10 members, all of which in the Middle East and heavily oil producers. No fewer than 34 more countries have now petitioned to join the BRICS. Furthermore, it is reported that at the BRICS next conference in late 2024, in October actually, in Kazan, and, quote, alternative global financial framework, unquote, will be announced. That will include some alternative currency arrangement, as well as an alternative international payment system to replace the U.S. SWIFT system, by which the USA via its banks can see who is violating its sanctions. So nobody will be able to tell who is violating the sanctions that have been ordered. That's rich. Likely forthcoming will be something to replace the U.S.-run IMF in order to ensure currency stability and an expansion of China's Belt and Road Initiative as an alternative to the U.S.-run World Bank. Perhaps that is the real topic of Blinken's forthcoming visit, ? I don't know if that was the real topic at all. I think Blinken was just making stupid threats that will only hurt us and help China and Russia and the alternative economy which is beginning to emerge. In short, the U.S. global economic empire is entering its most unstable period, and yet U.S. policy is to accelerate alternatives to it by seizing and transferring funds to Ukraine to continue the war. The blowback from the seizure and transfer will prove significant both to U.S. and European interests. It will render past resistance to U.S. sanctions pale in comparison. How to crash an empire. Honey? Okay, thanks. History will show that U.S. geopolitical objectives and strategies in the 21st century were the single greatest cause of the decline of U.S. global economic hegemony over the last quarter century. A bunch of those objectives and strategies have been the work of the most economically ignorant foreign policy team in U.S. history, who are generally referred to as the neocons. The seizure and transfer of $300 billion may provide a way to continue funding Ukraine and the U.S. NATO proxy war against Russia through 2024 and beyond. I don't really think so, because if the war in Ukraine ends as quickly as I now think it's going to, the seizure of that $300 billion, if the seizure, it all depends on the sequence. But if the seizure should happen and the transfer to Ukraine should happen before the fall, of Ukraine, then that $300 billion may end up, in the hands of the Russians in some way, or other. But anyway, it's certainly not going to do the U.S. any good. It's not going to be used for the transfer, of military equipment. But anyway, the timing could not be worse for U.S./Europe imperial interests coming on the eve of the historic BRICS conference later this year. The desperate act of seizure and transfer will only convince more countries of the global South to seek another more independent alternative by joining the BRICS or increasingly trade with that bloc. History shows empires rest ultimately on economic foundations. They collapse when those underlying economic foundations fracture and then crumble. The longer run consequence, thank you, honey. The longer run consequence of the $300 billion transfer and the exiting of global South from the U.S. empire can only be a decline in the use of the U.S. dollar in global transactions and as a reserve currency. That sets in motion a series of events that in turn undermine the U.S. domestic economy in turn. I don't know about that, because it depends upon what we do to build up the domestic economy. Jack Rasmus, from his economic point of view, doesn't spend much time thinking about the implications of the U.S. As a monetary sovereign, and the ability of the U.S. to use the expanded policy space that gives our government to shore up the domestic economy here. Going on. Less demand for the dollar results in a fall in the dollar's value. That means less recycling of dollars back to the United States, resulting in less purchases of U.S. Treasuries from the Federal Reserve. Fine. We might have to mint platinum coins or use overt congressional financing, which in turn will require the Fed to raise long-term interest rates for years to come in order to cover rising U.S. budget deficits. Not if the Fed begins to understand the MMT framework. It won't raise interest rates then, either for years to come or either in the short term. All this will happen to an intensifying fiscal crisis of the U.S. state, rapidly deteriorating already. In other words, blowback on the U.S. economy from declining U.S. global hegemony, exacerbated by sanctions in general and seizure of countries like Russia's assets in particular, is almost certain in the long run, just as it will be for Europe's economy in the even more immediate term. But such is the economic myopia of the U.S. Neocons and the incompetent political elite leadership in both parties in the USA in recent years, as that other American saying goes, quote, "We have found the enemy and they are us," unquote. Largely, I think that was a great piece. And is pretty good in discussing causal relations. What it doesn't take into account, actually, is the ability of the United States to adjust to any collapse in terms of its presence in the world economy, that we may see. We're still a land of great resources, and we still have extreme policy space to adapt, our economy, to changes. Now, it is true that if the neocons and the neoliberals continue to control U.S. politics, then what Jack Rasmus is sketching out here, the means of decline, of the U.S., is very likely to happen because we will still have, a Federal Reserve that knows only one thing to do when it sees inflation. And we also have a Congress that, and also a Treasury that sees only one thing to do when we have less purchases of U.S. Treasuries from the Federal Reserve. And that is issue more Treasuries and try to get people to buy them. They don't understand that Treasuries don't have to be issues. The extra money needed can be minted, or the Congress can order the Federal Reserve to produce the extra monies that are needed for deficit spending without issuance of any U.S. Treasuries, at all. And that money can be used to rebuild the economy here, in the U.S., so that we again become a manufacturing giant. And of course, just because we're a smaller economy, in terms of population, in the United States, even if we become a manufacturing giant, again, we will not equal the Chinese, but we can certainly be more important than we have been for years and years and years, as a manufacturing giant, producing its own goods and having a healthy economy based more on real output than on financial invention. So, I thought that article was important for you to see and for me to discuss. And we now move on to the third of our topics tonight. And that third topic is from an article by James K. Galbraith, the son of John Kenneth Galbraith. This was originally published in Sheer Post. I picked it up in Portside. Industrial policy is a good idea, but we don't have one. The American state has lost the capacity for concentrated and decisive effort at the forefront of technology and the associated science. So excuse me a moment while I take the pills Bonnie was kind enough to bring to me. There's a picture of Biden with a sign, saying Bidenomics in the background. Yeah, Bidenomics is rather terrible neoliberal stuff. And Jamie Galbraith says, in a remarkable and comprehensive book forthcoming from Cambridge University Press, Mark Fastow, and Ian Fletcher provide a theoretical, historical, and up-to-date review of industrial policies in the United States and elsewhere. as well as a decent summary of the main Biden initiatives, the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the CHIPS Act as of late 2023. Their goal is to justify, defend, and extend the case for industrial policies, which they do with admirably fair attention to unsuccessful past cases. Mine in this essay is actually narrower, mainly to describe the specific goals of President Biden's program and to assess the likelihood of success given their structure and methods. My background on this topic dates back to 1981, that's 43 years now, when under my supervision and editorship, the Congressional Joint Economic Committee published a study, quote, uh, uh, the title of which was Monetary Policy, Selective Credit Policy, and Industrial Policy in France, Britain, West Germany, and Sweden, unquote, which may reasonably be claimed as a forerunner of industrial policy debates and initiatives for the United States. John Zeisman and Stephen Cohn, who co-authored the essay on France with me, went on to found with Laura Tyson the Berkeley Roundtable on the International Economy, a fertile source of later work on industrial and technology policy. The JEC held hearings on industrial policy in 1983, and Kent Hughes, then of the JEC staff, went on to head the Council on Competitiveness. Threads of these ideas formed part of Gary Hart's unsuccessful bid for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1987-1988, in which I was again involved as an advisor. Tyson went on to chair the Council of Economic Advisors under President Clinton. The definition and goals of industrial policy. Industrial policy is the use of state power and public resources to build and maintain the capacity to produce specified lines of manufactured products, thereby developing and sustaining the associated techniques, technologies, and among the working population, the required engineering expertise and mastery of machines and techniques in the face of traditional textbook encomia to free markets, quote unquote. One can justify such efforts, as Fastow and Fletcher do, by appealing to every caveat lurking in the back pages of any competent text: externalities, public goods, time horizons, uncertainty, and increasing returns. Further, there is the thought that so long as other nations decline to adopt the free market worldview, it may be prudent to hedge against the possibility that they may know something the textbooks don't. An actual policy must be assessed against actual and not theoretical goals. One does not advance a bill through Congress by claiming to have discovered an externality. That's a joke. In American politics, it is useful to distinguish between goals that appeal broadly to a concept of public interest and those tailored to the narrow purposes of the power elite. These are roughly, not entirely, identifiable according to the forms in which they are emphasized, the campaign trail, for example, versus, say, a congressional hearing or a confidential briefing. Under the public interest rubric, one may fit a number of familiar tropes. Job creation is one, especially, quote, good jobs at good wages, unquote. There's a reference to Danny Roderick, 2023. He's a professor at Harvard. Export promotion is another, or import substitution, allied to the vague concept of competitiveness, which appears to mean the success of, quote, the American, unquote, corporations against, quote, foreign, unquote, rivals. A more concrete statement associates competitiveness with the trade balance. One goal asserted by Fastow and Fletcher is to reduce the trade deficit to zero, make the United States financially self-sufficient, though not necessarily in any particular good, service, or product line. Exactly why this would be desirable may not be clear, but it plays well in public and may be counted as one of the ostensible goals, of the policy. He's right about that, but I've written a book about who needs balanced budgets. Uh, I'm sorry, who needs balanced trade? Who needs balanced budgets? And that contends that we don't need either balanced trades, or balanced budgets. But my purpose here is not to discuss my book, but Jamie's article. Lurking behind these broad objectives are some narrow ones, which, though hardly hidden, play to a more focused gallery, including interests with, quote, skin in the game, unquote. Those seeking results that benefit their own material interests. The most obvious is the case for industrial policy as national security to support, quote, defense industrial base, unquote, to secure the supply chain, to develop the next generation of armaments, and so on. In this area, the stated objective of national defense and the pecuniary interests of military contractors are closely allied, indeed impossible to disentangle. However, while the former is a nebulous category whose very definition rests on and can be modified by changing strategic doctrines, the latter is a very precise question of billions of dollars and trillions of cents. Similar pressures apply in other sectors, among them pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, and civil aviation. The second related yet distinct concern is the, quote, threat, unquote, from a country designated as a peer competitor, quote unquote, in economic terms. At one time, the Soviet Union held this position thanks mainly to Sputnik. Later, it was Japan. Today, the focus of this preoccupation is China. Here, the stated or sometimes unstated goal of the policy is to shore up or restore a weakened position. The United States long ago came to grips with the globalization of textiles and apparel. Over the past 40 years, it has largely, not entirely, accepted the internationalization of steel, of aluminum, automobiles, also machine tools, and much else, including, of course, oil. Semiconductors are today's leading example, especially insofar as today's leading fabricator, Taiwan, may some way be reabsorbed by its mother country. The third specific source of pressure for industrial policy concerns the industries of, quote, the future, unquote, those exploiting new technological possibilities, promising new arenas for private profit, meeting new needs, or promising new pathways to national power and prestige. At various times in the 20th century, nuclear energy, the space race, and the internet played this role. In this century, motivated by climate change, quote, renewable energy, unquote, has taken a leading place in this niche, including the harvesting of solar energy for electricity, battery storage, and transportation, the latter taking the peculiar form of private cars rather than the well-established solution of electric trains, subways, and streetcars in compact cities, a model long ago adopted in much of the world. Who decides industrial goals and policies? The question of which precise policies actually get adopted in a given place of time is settled by the balance of influences in the decision-making structure. In countries often described as, quote, authoritarian, unquote, these decisions are largely reserved to planners, planning commissions, and associated ministries, with substantial control by engineers and other specialists. This was how Moscow obtained its metro and how China built its vast new high-speed rail network. It was also how France rebuilt its steel and railways after World War II and later moved from coal to nuclear power in its electrical system. It was how the United States built the atomic bomb in the 1940s and reached for the moon 2 decades later. Technological choices, by their nature, they're authoritarian to some degree. In the United States today, Congress plays a central role in designing and arbitrate choices of this kind. In that institution, since the early 1990s, professional expertise once vested in the staff and various technical appendages, have been radically devalued, making congressional decisions far more deeply influenced by outside lobbies. The structure of these, in turn, has shifted with the changing balance of power in the American economy to the advantage of tech sector oligarchs and bankers, but very notably, along with pharma, the military, and other emerging sectors, including biotech and now artificial intelligence. The role of unions, once quite powerful, has declined, as has that of citizen activist organizations. Faced with the realities of private power, the U.S. administrations have learned to tailor their proposals to the requirements of potentially successful coalitions. This has worked to reduce, practically speaking, to eliminate the formerly substantial influence of the academic and scientific sectors. Today, academics are called on, if at all, mainly to decorate a previously decided agenda. Biden's industrial policies and the macroeconomy. The Biden industrial policy, represented by the three acts previously mentioned, has been widely celebrated for three reasons. First, it was enacted and on a substantial scale. Second, it overrode the austerity lobby and their academic allies, the traditional gloom and doom position of mainstream economists when faced with anything decided by the government. And third, it weathered subsequent accusations of responsibility from the same quarters for the quasi-inflation of 2021 to 2022. It's a quasi-inflation, okay, in the sense that it wasn't a continuing inflation. Okay, it wasn't one, with accelerating uh, 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 price increases, but it was a real inflation in the sense that there was a jump in many of the prices that people live by something like 30%. Okay, over that period of time, placing great pressure on family budgets, including my own family. So, for the first time in decades, the United States has a plausible simulacrum of an industrial policy. The question to assess is whether and to what extent this policy has met or will meet any of its stated broad or narrow objectives. Through the early months of 2024, the Biden programs have a strong claim to having been a contributor to macroeconomic success. Economic growth, while not spectacular, has been steady. Unemployment has remained uh, 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 fairly low. Investment in manufacturing, though no longer large in relation to the whole economy, has been quite strong. An input-output study, Pollan et al., 2023, published by the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst in September 2023, credited the three bills together as likely to generate $300 billion in new investments and 2.9 million new jobs, sustained for as long as the spending continues. These estimates now appear optimistic, partly due to a slow rollout in the spending discussed below, and partly because estimates of the leverage, public dollars, stimulating private initiative, were too aggressive. Manufacturing employment as of March 2024 had gained 700,000 jobs since 2021. Yet the economy has not crumpled so far in the face of major increases in interest rates, and inflation, having peaked in June 2022, declined through early 2024, and some areas is declining now. Tax incentives. What did I see the other day that had really majorly declined? I was very surprised about it. I think it was the price of green onions had a sudden, reduction. Tax incentives can be credited with the role and the strength of business investment and spending, generally speaking, although other factors, including relatively favorable resource costs, expanding oil and gas production, and the serious problems facing Europe, okay, have also played a role. There's another area prices have fallen in the area of shiitake mushrooms. very important for our family. Quite predictably, with steady growth and high interest rates supporting the exchange value of the dollar, the U.S. trade and current account deficits have risen sharply. While it is unlikely that any parts of the Biden program would have yet yielded positive results for the trade balance in any event, even if they had, the larger forces of strong U.S. growth and attractive conditions for capital inflow would have overwhelmed now. Corresponding to the trade deficit is a very large federal budget deficit, which in turn predictably ignites renewed calls for retrenchment, especially against Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. The budget projections are made to look very much worse by adding prospective interest costs at the higher rates, assumed to continue indefinitely to the federal spending projections. In other words, one reason why the deficits are so high is because of the increased amount of interest that the Treasury Department is paying to the private sector. Because of course, the Treasury interest rates were driven higher by the Federal Reserve rates because they have to be higher. So the interests on bonds, on newly sold bonds, of course, increased. And in rough terms, I think the increase in interest paid by the federal government is from $440 billion to $1.2 trillion, or thereabouts, so maybe $1.3 trillion, by now. So that's a great increase, in the deficit, but it's, due to the interest costs. And so Jane points out, assumed to continue, indefinitely, because it's assumed that the Federal Reserve is going to keep those interest rates high. But the interest rates are a policy variable. They don't have to be kept high by the Federal Reserve. It's just the silly policy of the Federal Reserve that's keeping them high. Yet another layer of macro effects within which the consequences of the Biden initiatives are embedded concerns wages and corporate profits. Profits have done very well, rising sharply after the COVID debacle receded. Wages declined in real terms as the cost of living outstripped wage recovery in the quasi-inflation of 2021 and 2022, even though for many households, the difference was made up by earlier relief payments. What he's talking about here was the stimulus checks. More recently, real wages appear to have begun to recover, but household incomes, which take account of multiple earners, have not returned to pre-pandemic trends. In some, despite uninterrupted good news on the big three headline indicators, growth, unemployment, inflation, the macro record of Biden's industrial policies has to be judged as somewhat mixed. The trade effect so far is actually negligible. The budget effect could bring a backlash. Renewed austerity on key social programs threatens, and the wage earnings picture is not as rosy as that for profits. Biden's industrial policy specific goals. We turn next to the specific goals of each element of the Biden initiatives. The BIL, the infrastructure bill, the IRA, and the CHIPS Act. Of these, the infrastructure law is easiest to evaluate because this Fasto and Fletcher report is spread out over 7,000 projects in 4,000 communities. As of November 2023, the number claimed had risen to 40,000 from the White House 2023. Data are, however, specified to be, quote, a preliminary and non-binding, unquote. Highways and bridges form the largest component, absorbing over half of the money so far. The Guardian 2024. Other elements include airports, water systems, toxic waste cleanup, extending broadband in the electrical grid, and some protections for suppliers of steel. The BIL is, in short, diffuse. The specific priorities served are necessarily those of state and local authorities. While the funds are no doubt welcome and the improvements are real, it is nevertheless that the projects have few, if any, implications for competitiveness or industrial productivity. They fade quickly into the warp and woof of urban and suburban existence. Their implications for commercial endeavors largely benefit the real estate developers who have no presence in the international economy. No grand vision and few signature projects appear to have been built into the legislation. The big ones include a new tunnel under the Hudson, uh, also another under the Baltimore Harbor, and a bridge in Cincinnati. The facts of diffusion and decentralization, with something for everyone, undoubtedly helped the BIL to avoid partisan obstructions on the way to becoming law. The Inflation Reduction Act. A major purpose of the Inflation Reduction Act is to foster the growth of renewable energy sources and uses, notably the electric vehicle sector. The major method is tax credits for business investments in renewables and a tax rebate, $7,500 for purchases of electric cars, as well as for appliances, batteries, and solar panels. The benefits from these measures are limited to firms conducting a large share of the activities in North America, especially the final assembly of cars. Healthcare provisions were also included in the law, including measures to reduce the price of pharmaceutical products. These are not an element of industrial policy. The tax subsidies have fostered an expansion of solar and wind electricity generation and the construction of new factories for electric cars in the United States. Advocates for clean power claim 83 new manufacturing plants have been announced. Up to 170 are the new or expanded, The Economist 2023. The White House claims many new renewable energy projects, large and small, especially offshore power generation. The White House 2023A. Nevertheless, the challenges facing renewable electricity generation are daunting. In brief summary, electricity production has always heretofore been a matter of one-way diffusion. Electricity is produced in high concentrations and distributed to consumers over a network of wires and transformers. Production is of two types: base load, such as nuclear, coal, and hydro, which largely runs all the time, and peak load, for which natural gas is optimal, as it can be switched on and off rapidly as needed. Renewables add the complexity of a diffuse production system. The power is generally collected from many relatively small sources, such as windmills. Solar farms could be larger, and transmitted to the consuming area over lines that in many cases do not yet exist. According to the Department of Energy, a grid expansion of more than 50% would be required to move to a carbon-free system, given the need for highly skilled labor and the complexity and cost of electrical equipment, very much of it imported. This objective cannot be met. The current rate of grid expansion, including renovations, is a small fraction of the required rate, but renewables are also neither base nor peak. Their output varies with the weather, not with the demand. So they need a further element, which is electricity storage, a massive rechargeable battery system for which the technologies do not yet exist and possibly may never exist given the physics of batteries and the limitations on the relevant resources. Further, the large renewable energy projects the IRA envisions are long-term and capital-intensive. They require large fixed investments up front in the hope of operating for decades at low variable cost with the sunlight that powers them arriving free of charge. Their economic viability is therefore a matter of the cost of capital, which is a matter of the rate of interest. Since the product associated with the enterprise, specifically electricity, must compete at a price determined by the fossil fuel competition and is entirely homogeneous to the consumer, the margins to be expected from these investments are low. Financing the capital at 2% is one thing. Doing so at 6 or 7% is something entirely different. The Federal Reserve's movement to raise interest rates can be expected to wreak havoc with such investments, and reports of project cancellation are therefore not surprising. Front-end tax subsidies will only carry a business project so far. Finally, despite the grand stated goals, there is no compelling reason to expect that the resulting tangle of new electricity generation, efficient machinery, zero emissions transportation, quote unquote, will actually reduce emissions of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The IRA explicitly promotes the growth of U.S. fossil fuel production. Reductions in U.S. CO2 emissions have been achieved, but they are due to large measure to substitution of natural gas for coal, and not to large inroads by renewables into the production of electrical power. Apart from this, the Jevons law, laid down 150 years ago, provides the reason. New energy resources and more efficient uses invariably add to total production and consumption rather than fully replacing the previous methods and uses. The law has not been repealed, nor will it be in the U.S. and globally, so long as fossil fuels are accessible and cheap and vastly more energy productive in relation to their cost of extraction than are renewables. Finally, the very nature of energy policy, even if successful, even if economic, even if it were to make a noticeable contribution to mitigating climate change, ensures that the political benefits of the policy are likely to be small, like roads and water pipes. Also, electricity fades into the background of daily life. Unless the policy reduces energy costs, providing energy from renewable sources has no benefits to industrial users either. And since current CO2 levels liken climate effects for decades hence, even the environmental benefits of any, if any, will not be seen by most people in their own lifetimes. In 50 or more years, the most favorable verdict that is possible will be, quote, not as bad as it might have been, unquote. With respect to electric cars, it is also not obvious that the resulting vehicles can be sold at a profit. By its own account, Ford lost $4.7 billion on electric cars in 2023, or just under $65,000 per vehicle. This is from Bryce, 2024, possibly an overstatement, but still. Tesla has been discounting heavily. Hertz has given up on EVs for rentals, and uptake of new electric cars appears concentrated in a handful of high-income regions. Limitations on range, charging stations, and capital costs of the vehicles may constitute enduring barriers to the large-scale adaptation of electric vehicles. Perhaps particularly when compared to hybrids, the option favored by Toyota, and therefore an import to the United States. Outside the U.S., the Chinese competition has a cost advantage, thanks to scale and highly automated production processes. So there is little scope for U.S. electric vehicles in third country markets. Moving to the CHIPS Act. The main purpose of the CHIPS Act is to restore U.S. Manufacturing capacity in semiconductors, partly at the expense of the world dominant facilities presently in Taiwan, and to impede or thwart a competitive threat, so it's claimed, from China. Semiconductor capacity is also claimed to be essential for military and national security reasons that are associated with reconnaissance, surveillance, information processing, command and control, and other functions. Once again, the Biden policy has had a front-end effect, most notably the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, TSMC, has undertaken to build, quote, fabs, unquote, in Arizona. Work is underway, though not without delays and difficulties. Lee and Wu, 2024. Ting Fang and Lee, 2024. The first Lee is spelled L-E-E, and the second Lee, is L-I. Whether the facts show the two different people. Whether the factories will function effectively is an open question. Whether they will be profitable, is another. The report from Brookings raises doubts. That's by Herhan and Chapman, 2023. Time will tell. Meanwhile, Senator Elizabeth Warren and Representative Pramila Jayapal have raised concern that the process of allocating funds under the Act has been largely delegated to a group of financiers drawn from Wall Street. What else is new? In the present and immediate future, we may reasonably expect the following consequences of a reshoring policy for semiconductor. If the price of the resulting chips is higher than the world price for equivalent capability, American consumers of end products will either shift demand to goods made from offshore chips or pay more for the local product, which might happen if there's essentially protectionist policies, so we can't get the offshore chips. If the policy deprives China or any other capable competitors of advanced semiconductor designs or production capabilities, e.g., lithography machines, they may be expected to accelerate their own research and development in this area, which they've been doing, of course, as has been done with every strategic technology in the past. If a competitor has control of an important precursor material, it may be expected to use that control to its own advantage, as China is doing with respect to germanium and gallium. Measures to move the raw material sourcing away from China are in the legislation, but their effectiveness is unproven. The government of Taiwan, facing the reality that U.S. policy aims to deprive it of its one greatest economic asset, may draw conclusions and move toward an accommodation with the PRC, the People's Republic of China, of course. The difficulty with competitive chess is that one's opponent always has the next move. However, it may be that these consequences of a hypothetically successful policy will not be felt, at least not soon, simply because the policy itself may prove to be a chimera. According to the law, a formal evaluation from the Government Accountability Office is not due until 2025, safely past the next election. But the preliminary evidence suggests that the administering agency has received many proposals, made few allocations, and not only a small part of the $52 billion approved under the Act had been spent as of a year after the enactment. Well, that's something. When and if it is, it will be spread over many relatively small research, development, and fab operations. This approach contrasts quite sharply with the concentrated structure of the semiconductor industry in Taiwan or elsewhere, but is well suited to the American system of log rolling, coalition building, and the priority of narrative over results. To the system, in 2 words, of money politics. So again, we get back to money politics disadvantaging us, the role of big money in politics. Conclusions. As noted earlier, the history of industrial policy is dotted with successes in the United States, including nuclear power and the space program, not to mention the internet. In our 2021 book, The Mission Economy, Mariana Mazzucato gives a detailed description of a narrow example, the development of the Lunar Excursion Module, the LEM, by Grumman for NASA in the Apollo program. These examples look nothing at all like the Biden initiatives. Why is that? The answer lies deeper than in the limitations or disingenuousness of this or any other administration. Rather, the American state has lost the capacity for concentrated and decisive effort at the forefront of technology and the associated science. For 44 years, and especially since the early 90s, the Gingrich revolution, unquote, in Congress and the triumph of neoliberalism in the Clinton and Bush years, the U.S. government has been working hard to eliminate its own technical capabilities. In their place, a constellation of lobbies, privately funded think tanks, and tax subsidy farmers has grown up, many of them talented at projecting the impression of scientific authority, which crowds out whatever genuine authority may still exist. We can see this in every domain, including climate, public health, and the cybersphere. And behind the cacophony of a marketplace of ideas, quote unquote, legions of economists chime in to advocate for decentralized, competitive, market-based solutions guided by price incentives, taxes, tax breaks, and subsidies. It can be little wonder, then, that when the government is called upon to specify exactly how to proceed, for instance, to evaluate grant applications or to judge the viability of a major private initiative, it doesn't know how, except perhaps by the path of least political resistance. There is yet a deeper reason. Ever since the launch of industrial policy debates in the early 1980s, the commanding heights of the U.S. economy have been firmly held by high finance, and the overriding objective of policy has been global power projection. financial, technological, and military, with close interaction between technological and military sectors. Hope for an industrial policy oriented toward civilian competition, foundered in the 1980s under the high dollar and the flood of imports it induced, crushing the core of American manufacturing, dislocating the engineers and the skilled machinists once employed in the sector. In the 1990s and beyond, the Chinese juggernaut gathered momentum under the same umbrella, gradually eroding the margins of high technology still dominated by the U.S. Today, even U.S. military production, a mainstay of the remaining manufactured exports, has large elements of foreign sourcing, including in some notorious instances from China. This is from Michael Hudson, 2022. Okay, today, financial power, the dollar system, remains a cornerstone of the U.S. economic strategy long after the mid-20th century industrial basis of that power disappeared and its long-lived technological and military props have eroded. As every country that ever experienced Dutch disease had learned, there is a deep contradiction between financial preeminence and industrial competitiveness, which no amount of specific subsidy can erase and which trade protection cannot cure. It is impossible for a polity dominated by Wall Street to acknowledge, let alone resolve, this contradiction, which, of course, again, brings us back to dumping the corruption, getting Wall Street out of the polity. That is so important. Today's advocates and champions of industrial policy are, in many cases, the same people. Galbraith 2023b, who helped to pioneer the concept back in the early 1980s. Back then, one could draw on the experiences of the United States from the 1930s to the 1960s and on those of Europe in the years of post-war reconstruction and social democratic growth. The foundation of scientists, engineers, machinists, and productive organizations by large industrial corporations appeared solid. Industrial policy was or seemed to be a task of setting out goals and coordinating strategies. But time passes and things change. The Reagan years dealt a heavy blow to the industrial core. The Clinton years enshrined neoliberal mismanagement of the larger economy. That was mitigated only by the rise of a very thin veneer of technical excellence in the information sector. Okay, God damn it. I just noticed that I recently forgot to share this. So I will now belatedly share this wonderful article. The relevant industrial personnel were not reproduced and to a considerable degree no longer exist. A quarter century has passed since then. It is a tragedy for America that the concept of industrial policy has taken hold. Perhaps 30 or even 50 years since the capacity to do a proper job began to decline. To be fair, the Biden packages contain many good and useful things. Jobs are created, roads will be repaired, and bridges will be replaced. The internet may eventually reach the most remote backwaters of Appalachia and the Vermont Hills. Electric vehicles may find an enduring niche in the transportation ecology. Wind turbines and solar panels will add something to the electrical supply, and new uses for batteries may be found. These developments may contribute to security and self-sufficiency in domestic markets. Whether the U.S. will regain its lost edge in semiconductors seems less likely, as the countercurrents of the high dollar and Chinese competence, as well as control over both precursor materials and downstream markets, appear very strong. Does the whole amount to an industrial policy creating new American competitiveness on the world stage? This seems quite far from the case. And will all the sound and fury make a difference to voters in 2024? That too remains to be seen. But if so, it will be due mainly to effective marketing of the narrative and not much to actual achievement of the stated goals. That is a gloomy assessment of what is going on with respect to the economy and the likely future, okay, of the nation. Okay, it is well researched. Uh, it is well referenced. It is just, okay, an excellent job altogether. But it suggests, okay, what it suggests is that we cannot continue with the same arrangement of politics and expect to be successful. We cannot have the continued dominance, okay, of the oligarchy. It just will not allow this country to adapt, okay, to change. We have had, okay, an adaptiveness problem now for a very, very long time. And solving that problem, as I said before, comes back to dumping the corruption and getting the special interests out of politics. We've got to have the special interests out of politics. If we don't get that, if we don't get an entirely new Congress and executive branch and judiciary, we are going nowhere when it comes to adaptation to the postmodern world. The postmodern world is what we are getting here in spades with the Belt and Road Initiative. That is the real postmodern world. The emergence of the global South is the real postmodern world. And we in the United States have not been adapting to that. We have been fighting it. And of course, the people who run us, okay, the elites who run us and who run our political system, are trying their damnedest, okay, to defend their own financial interests and to refrain from allowing the United States to adapt to the global changes that are going on. If we don't adapt, time to get out of Dodge. It's maybe time to get out of Dodge, but for those who want to stay here and fight, the imperative is to change that political system quite thoroughly. And right now, and I hate to say this because I think it's very low probability, the primary hope for change lies with a lot of bottom-up voting to kick people out of office and with the extremely long shot chance to win, okay, of Jill Stein, who at least will listen to the post-Keynesian economists, including the MMT economists, and including those who will entertain the idea of industrial policy. And with that said, I will turn to your comments. Kay says, Columbia U is coming apart. NYPD is going in soon. I thought the NYPD's already been in. Steve says, Richard's videos were brutal to watch, I'll bet. Andy says, that Naomi piece is very stirring. My eyes stay watery these days. Lisa joined us at 9:20. Hey, folks. Steve said, hi, Lisa. Sabby was playing BB's outrageous lies. It's frustrating. Kay says, hi, Lana. I guess Lana's here too. Steve Wolfbrand says, USC is within walking distance. I suppose I should get over there to support the students off campus. If you get over there to support them, be careful, Steve. Be very careful. Kay says, hi, Lisa. Steve says, there's a police standoff with a shooting suspect across the street right now. So it's noisy and crazy here at the moment, I'll bet. Kay says, Stacy, okay, guys, I'm out of here. Love you all, says Kay. Steve Wolpern says, good night, Kay. There are police officers entering Hamilton Hall on Columbia University with their goddamn guns drawn. Oh, God damn it. Kent State all over again, but worse. They have locked the students inside. Lisa, that sucks. Steve Wolpern says, time to get out of Dodge. Yeah. Maybe so. Any further comments? Then I will thank you all for coming. I may be the only one who thinks so, but I think this was a great stream, very, very significant. I'm considering replaying the Galbraith article maybe sometime very, very soon. But for tomorrow, what I plan to do right now is to, let me look up my plans for tomorrow. What I plan to do for tomorrow is to talk about Project 2025. This is a special request, okay, from Lana. Okay, there's an old article from November 7th, 2023 from the Prospect, okay, to review, and another article, okay, that appeared, okay, in Portside about the Project 2025 plans. Lana was very concerned about those, so I decided to take up this project. Project 2025 concerns. So the stream is called Empowering Democracy Project 2025 Redux. And so that's what's coming tomorrow night. I hope you'll all be here. I think that should be a very good stream too. Steve says good night. Good night, Steve. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Lisa, for coming. Thank you, Lana, for coming. And thank you, Kay, of course. And thank you, Andy. And also thank you, everyone. Even those I can't directly see, probably operating on Twitter. I'll see you tomorrow. I'll be going on at 8 o'clock tomorrow, as most of you know. I do 9 o'clocks on Tuesday, but I do my 8 o'clocks on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Thank you very much. And once again, good night.